Welcome back to the Marvel Podcast for gifted listeners. I hope you enjoyed the look into the weird life of Matt Murdock and his alter ego, the Devil of Hell's Kitchen. This week, we're going to be looking at the rights battles of Marvel Comics, TV, and movies. Have you ever wondered why it took until 2016 for Spider-Man to join up with the Avengers? Or why the X-Men were so isolated when the MCU was hitting its high? Or why Quicksilver was called Enhanced instead of a mutant in Age of Ultron? Well, ponder no more. This episode aims to answer all of those questions and more. In Phase 1, we will do a quick recap of how the rights battles started. In Phase 2, we will talk about individual movies and character rights. And Phase 3, we will talk about television and animation rights, which are two weirdly separate entities. So now, let's get into Phase 1 of the Marvel rights battles. Before the 1980s, Marvel had the rights to make whatever product they wanted with their intellectual properties. In 1977, there was a Spider-Man made-for-TV movie featuring the Japanese Spider-Man, which we have mentioned in episode 2, and a 1978 TV movie featuring Doctor Strange. So in 1986, New World Pictures would acquire Marvel Comics Group and Marvel Productions and create the Marvel Entertainment Group. The first movie released under this new company was The Incredible Hulk Returns in 1988, featuring Lou Ferrigno in the titular monstrous role. In 1989, McAndrews and Forbes Holdings acquired Marvel Entertainment Group for $82.5 million, but allowed New World to keep Marvel Productions. Ron Perlman, who we talked about in episode 3, said that Marvel is a mini Disney in terms of intellectual property. Disney's got much more highly recognized characters and softer characters, whereas our characters are termed action heroes. But at Marvel, we are now in the business of the creation and marketing of characters. And to do this, in 1989, Punisher was co-produced by New World Pictures. Then in the 1990s, Marvel went public, offering 40% of their shares to the public, promising to the public that they would expand into merchandise such as action figures and stickers. To help with the action figures side of it, Marvel acquired 46% of Toy Biz. The CEO of Toy Biz at the time would then transition to the position of CEO and president of Marvel Films. Soon the toys weren't making as much money as Perlman initially projected, and so he wanted to merge Toy Biz and Marvel together. But the shareholders were not going to go for that. So, basically, Perlman instead declared bankruptcy and merged them so that basically, because the company went bankrupt, there was nothing for the shareholders to have shares in. And now he wanted to get the heroes of Marvel to the big screen. And, needing money to do that, Perlman started to sell the movie rights to Marvel characters. So now that we know a little bit of background and kind of, what happened, we will now start to look more closely in Phase 2. New Line Cinemas was one of the first companies to buy the film rights. They would buy the rights to Blade and, surprisingly, Iron Man. And then one of the next companies to look into buying film rights would be Columbia Pictures, who actually were the initial landing place for the X-Men. But, in a strange turn of events, it was Fox who ultimately put their money where their mouth was, and scooped up the franchise right out from under Columbia's nose. Because basically Columbia was kind of dragging their feet on it, and Fox showed up was like, hey, here we go, here's the money. And that's how Fox got the rights to the X-Men. X-Men would go on to be the biggest movie of the summer of 2000. and help Marvel begin to get out of debt. And there would be a legal battle over some of this stuff that we will go over in the TV section, because it has to do with Marvel trying to make a TV show about mutants when they technically weren't allowed to. Avid Arad, who was in charge of the studio, purposely split up the rights to create momentum so no one studio could cannibalize efforts with one property for the sake of another. So basically, he wanted other studios to have stuff so that, like, they couldn't be like, oh, we're gonna not put as much effort into the X-Men so that Spider-Man can have better numbers, or vice versa. So, in 2001, the Ultimate Comics had been selling so well that Hollywood was now more interested. Now, Columbia's back in the picture, and they would get the rights to Spider-Man. And Columbia and Sony were a similar conglomerate. They would have the rights, and they would begin production on the first Spider-Man movie starring Tobey Maguire. And that movie would go on to gross over $400 million at the box office. And because of this high return, that would lead them to greenlighting sequels almost immediately. Well, before the movie really started to take off, and they began looking into how to develop it, there was a big question around Hollywood was, would the new Spider-Man project used the James Cameron script that had been worked on previously that was apparently infamous around Hollywood at the time. When Amy Pascal was put in charge of the Spider-Man project, it was unsure if she would use the script, which they ultimately would go on to not, but some elements of that script did make it into Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, one of which being the organic webs that we see Tobey Maguire have instead of using a web shooter like he would in the comics. And Amy Pascal would actually work on pretty much every Sony Spider-Man project, up to and including Spider-Man Brand New Day, which we now know is going to be releasing in 2026. Another one of Marvel's biggest heroes that his rights were not always part of Marvel's repertoire was the Incredible Hulk. His rights were owned by Universal Studios, and the studio would produce the 2003 Ang Lee Hulk film featuring Eric Bana. But when they did not produce a sequel to this movie, the rights reverted back to Marvel. And yes, even though Marvel has the rights, they would have to distribute the film jointly with Universal still. And basically, Marvel and Disney don't want to share the distribution rights with Universal. Going back to some other projects, leading up to the X-Men's release, Marvel Studios negotiated a deal with the then functional Artisan Entertainment, who are probably best well known for producing the Blair Witch Project. And in this deal, they would get the rights to 15 characters, including Captain America, Thor, Black Panther, Iron Fist, and Deadpool. And this would include TV rights, movie rights, and internet movie rights, which were a very new thing at the time, as well as direct-to-video movies. And when all these talks were happening, Wesley Snipes was actually slated to produce and star as the Black Panther. These rights were happening at the same time that Blade was being made, so Wesley Snipes would have been two famous black Marvel heroes. The rights to Black Panther would be returned in 2005. Artisan Studios would file for bankruptcy, and this deal for these 15 movies would never actually go through. So, moving on to 2004, David Maisel was hired as Chief Operating Officer of Marvel Studios, as he had planned for the studio to self-finance movies. Marvel entered into a non-recourse financing structure with Merrill Lynch that was collateralized by certain movie rights to a total of 10 characters from Marvel's vast vault. In this deal, Marvel got $525 million to make a maximum of 10 movies, based on the company's properties over 8 years, according to the parameters of this deal. Those characters would include Ant-Man, The Avengers, Black Panther, Captain America, Cloak and Dagger, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Nick Fury, Power Pack, and Shang-Chi. Now that this deal was in place, Marvel now needed a distributor for their films. Originally Universal, then Paramount. In 2005, the rights to Iron Man reverted back to Marvel, and in November 2006, the rights to the Hulk, as well as April 2006, Thor was also brought back to Marvel. In 2005, it was announced that they would make an Iron Man movie. 2006, it was announced they'd make the Hulk movie. And as well in 2006, it was announced Thor is going to be a Marvel Studios movie, once the rights had reverted back to Marvel from Sony. And in the same year, the rights to Black Widow had been returned to Marvel. And like I mentioned earlier, in 2006, the reason that the Hulk's rights had reverted back is because Universal failed to enter production for a sequel of Ang Lee's Hulk movie. And then in 2007, in a dispute over film releases, Avid Arad steps down as president, and a young junior executive who had been working with Marvel for a bit became the president and began his production of Iron Man in 2007. And who is that young junior executive? None other than the now face of Marvel, Kevin Feige. Once the MCU had kicked off and began to release movies, Marvel would actually hire a team of writers to help them integrate lesser-known heroes such as Black Panther, Cable, Doctor Strange, Iron Fist, Nighthawk, and Vision. The Cable movie never actually made anywhere because Cable was still owned by Fox. And it seems like Disney and Marvel really tried to just use X-Men characters whenever they could, even though they legally really couldn't. The works done by these writers would be property of Marvel, and all final say would go through Kevin Feige. And then, in the last hours of 2009, Marvel announced the merger with the Walt Disney Company. All previous film distribution rights would be honored. In 2010, Marvel would set up their television studio, and that is what Marvel Animation would be under. In 2010, Marvel set up their television studio, and that is what Marvel Animation would be under. Also in 2010, Disney bought the distribution rights for Iron Man 3 and The Avengers from Paramount, but the Paramount logo would remain at the beginning of the movie. In 2012, Fox approached Marvel/Disney about the rights to Daredevil, which they had owned, because the rights were about to revert back to them, and they basically wanted to extend the deadline because they had no plans to produce a new Daredevil film by late 2012. But Marvel rebuffed them, and on October 10th, 2012, the Daredevil rights reverted back to Marvel Studios. 2012 was also another big year for Marvel, because that's when The Amazing Spider-Man was released, and Marvel and Sony negotiated a two-way agreement. Basically, Disney would receive full merchandising ancillary rights to future Spider-Man films in exchange for Sony purchasing out Marvel's film participation rights. It is also the same year that they purchased the distribution rights to Iron Man, Iron Man 2, Thor, and Captain America the First Avenger from Paramount. So now all the MCU movies were Disney's to distribute. In 2013, the rights of Ghost Rider, Punisher, and Luke Cage were also returned to Marvel from the respective studios that they had belonged to. And Kevin Feige confirmed that Elektra also got returned to Marvel when Daredevil's rights were. So, like I mentioned earlier, Wanda and Pietro were able to appear in both the foxverse and the MCU. because of the characters both being mutants and Avengers. But this came with some caveats. In the foxverse, they could be portrayed however they were portrayed in the comics. But in the MCU, they had to stick to strict guidelines, such as they could not be referred to as mutants, hence why they were called enhanced individuals, and they also couldn't have their powers from birth because of the mutant X gene. And there could also be no connection to their father, Magneto. The comics would actually go and kind of mess with their origins to match the MCU better because the MCU was Marvel's big moneymaker at the time. Then in February 2015, Spidey finally came home to the MCU with the deal that Marvel Studios and Sony would collaborate to make the next Spider-Man movie. Amy Pascal and Kevin Feige would work together on the project, and Sony would have the distribution rights and finance the film, as well as have final creative say, but now Spidey could appear in the MCU. So it was basically just like, yeah, you can use him, but we still get to say everything about him. And then in June of that year, Kevin Feige clarified that the initial Sony deal does not allow Spider-Man to appear in any of the MCU television series, as it was very specific with a certain amount of back and forth allowed. And he had to clarify that probably because of the Daredevil series, and Daredevil and Spider-Man have been known to work together in the comics a lot. And in August of 2015, Marvel would be fully integrated into the Walt Disney Company. Post-2015, all the way up until 2019, Marvel now had the rights to pretty much all of their characters except for X-Men and related characters, and Fantastic Four and related characters. There were questions about Namor because it's a weird thing of like, he's kind of a Fantastic Four character, but not really, and like, Kevin Feige said that they could not make a solo Namor movie because of a bunch of red tape and how Universal still kind of had the rights, but not really. But the character did belong to the studio, and he was able to be put into other movies, kind of like how the Hulk is. And then in March of 2019, Disney acquired 20th Century Fox, and with this acquisition, the remaining Marvel properties returned to Marvel Studios, leading to the word mutant being used in MCU movies, as well as X-Men characters beginning to show up in the MCU. And now in 2025, when I am recording this episode, there have been a handful of mutants who have made their appearances in the MCU, such as Deadpool and Wolverine, Kelsey Grammer's Beast, and most of the villains from the X-Men franchise. And later this year, we will see the Fantastic Four in their MCU debut. And then in 2026, we will see so many more characters from across Marvel's history in Avengers Doomsday, now that they have all the rights back. So now let's take a look at Marvel television rights in Phase 3, which are so much less complicated. Like, there's barely anything. And the only hiccups really have to do with mutants and Spider-Man. And we will get into that in Phase 3. One early animation project that was going to be produced by Hio Saban was a Captain America cartoon, but the Saban company went bankrupt, and so that got canceled. When it comes to animation, Marvel has pretty much kept the rights to all their stuff, except for a handful of animation projects that were done in the 60s and 70s, or pretty much anything produced by Sony. Some of the shows that they do not own were the Fantastic Four cartoon made in 1967, which is actually owned by Warner Brothers due to their ownership of Hanna-Barbera. Because Hanna-Barbera was such a big name in cartooning at the time, they used a studio, and now because Warner Brothers owns Hanna-Barbera, it technically isn't. Marvel does not own that. As well as The Thing, which was a TV show in 1979, who's also owned by Warner Brothers due to the same reasoning. And then a handful of shows such as Spider-Man, the new animated series, The Spectacular Spider-Man, and anything under the Marvel anime banner are all are all owned by Sony. I do plan to do a future episode on Marvel anime, just because those were a few very interesting series that kind of took the Marvel mythos and, gave us a Japanese-esque style of it. When it comes to live action, we're going to just take a quick peek at the legal battle between Fox and Marvel in 2003 that I mentioned earlier. When it comes to live action television, there was the legal battle between Fox and Marvel in 2003 that I mentioned earlier in the episode. Basically because Marvel tried to make a show called Mutant X. The problem was that when the rights to the X-Men were sold to Fox, they had the exclusive rights to the word mutant and the X-Men characters. Marvel tried to circumvent this by making this show. Basically trying to be like, oh no, we can still make the show. But because of them using mutant, and they also would use audio and visuals from the first X-Men movie to promote this show, which they did not have the rights to those. So they tried to basically use the first X-Men movie as their jumping off point for this series. And ultimately Fox did win the case because, Marvel they tried to weasel their way into a TV show, and they just did not. In 2013, when Marvel had the rights to Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, and Iron Fist, it was announced that these properties would be handed over to Netflix to produce those 4 shows, plus the ensemble show of The Defenders. And after this announcement, in a press conference, Bob Iger did state that if these shows did well on Netflix, then we could see these characters in the movies. And what a lie that was, because we're now just seeing Daredevil return to the MCU after 12 years. And then, also, the reason because of it taking so long was that once the Netflix shows had been canceled, the studio had to wait 2 years before they could add those characters into the MCU because of the contract they had with Netflix. So, at the time, they would have had to wait until 2020 to use any of the characters again on Disney+. Marvel would also work with ABC to make Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter. They did try for some spin-offs, but those did not come to be. In 2017, Marvel and Fox would reconcile their past of, trying to make an X-Men show without Fox's permission, and they would make Legion and Gifted for FX. FX would also have the rights to play Iron Man 2, Hulk, and Thor, as well as any projects that had been released post-Thor, all the way up until September 2014. In September 2014, TNT acquired the cable rights for Age of Ultron, Civil War, and the 3 films that would precede this. And that would be released after they would air on TNT 2 years after their theatrical release. They would also get the right. They would also be able to air the films that had been previously airing on FX since 2008. And then another thing that I had mentioned earlier was how Spider-Man can't appear in MCU television, and it also kind of works the other way around, where certain characters related to Spider-Man can't appear in movies, but they could appear in TV shows, such as Kingpin. Because Kingpin is also a Daredevil villain, he can't appear in the TV shows, but because he's also under Spider-Man's moniker, he cannot appear in any movies. Vincent D'Onofrio actually recently expressed this annoyance in a recent podcast interview. And with that, I hope that you have a slightly better understanding of the Marvel character rights after this episode. Because you know what? I know I do. Because I only kind of knew the surface of, Fox, Sony, and Universal. Now let's go over the top 5 things we learned in today's episode. Number 1. In the 1990s, Marvel was facing bankruptcy, and thus they began selling off the movie rights to their characters. Number 2, all the characters that were sold off would have clauses in these contracts that if a film was not produced with the character in it within a specified amount of time, the characters would revert back to Marvel. Hence how Marvel got back Iron Man, Black Panther, Black Widow, Thor, and pretty much all their characters they did not get by acquiring the company that owned them. Number 3, Sony is one of the only original studios who bought rights to still hold the full control of the character. All their characters are back under Marvel's control. Number 4, Marvel tried to produce an X-Men television series in live action without Fox's consent and had to face legal repercussions for it. And number 5, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff were 2 characters that got to be used by both Marvel and Fox because of them having classifications in the comics as both X-Men and Avengers. And so, the movie rights have always been something that has always fascinated me since I began to understand that there's different studios that made different films. And like I said, I kind of knew the basics of Sony, Fox, Universal, like, oh yeah, Sony has Spider-Man, Fox has X-Men. But this episode I was able to go a little deeper and see how deep it really went with all the different studios buying all these rights and how it got reverted back to the studio and all that. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by myself, James Bazinski. Intro music sourced from freesound.org, as well as the timeline sound and the outro music. You can find us on Instagram at TMPFGL, YouTube at the Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners, and on TikTok at TMPFGL. If you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions, they can be emailed to tmpfgl@gmail.com. Please like, subscribe, and rate the show wherever you listen. Until next time, gifted listeners, thank you for listening, and Excelsior!